This is Colin O'Keefe here for LXBN TV. Answers are beginning to surface around the tragic crash of AirAsia Flight 8501, but there are still plenty of questions. Joining me now to answer some of those questions from Los Angeles is attorney Mike Danko. He is author of the Aviation Law Monitor. Mike, first off, where do things stand on the potential cause of this tragedy? Do previous air accidents shed any light or serve as any point of comparison for what happened here with this crash?
Well, Colin, we really don't know too much about the cause. There's certainly a lot of talk about it. All we really know for sure at this point is that the pilot encountered bad weather, and shortly after encountering that weather, turbulent weather, the aircraft lost contact and ultimately crashed. There are some other accidents that are certainly come to mind as being perhaps similar that investigators are going to be looking at and people are very interested in. One is a crash of American Airlines 587 off of JFK back in 2001. And that's very interesting because what happened there is the pilot encountered some turbulence and the tail fell off the aircraft as a result of how the pilot interacted with that turbulence. The reason why it's interesting is that was the same type of aircraft involved in this accident. So investigators are going to be looking to see whether the aircraft itself, there may be a problem with the aircraft itself, as there was in 2001 in American Airlines 587. The accident seems to be at this point perhaps similar to Air France 447, which was from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. The aircraft encountered icing conditions, the pitot tube iced over, and the pilots basically lost the flight information they needed to keep the plane upright. But what's interesting is there's another crash, and that was Adam Air Flight 547 in 2007, and that was an Indonesian airline that was lost over Indonesian waters just like this shortly after encountering some bad weather. And it's perhaps the most instructive at all because it looked very, very similar. But after we got the black boxes and after the investigation was done, it was determined it had nothing to do with the weather at all. It was the pilots became preoccupied with a relatively minor discrepancy in the cockpit, and they just let the airplane essentially get upside down. So the lesson is really, despite what we know about the weather, and what it appears happened, you really can't tell until you get your hands on the black boxes. You can't jump to conclusions.
Absolutely. As you mentioned, there are a lot of hypotheses out there about what might have happened. But yeah, like you mentioned, we really don't know quite yet. So second, a separate question is, what does compensation look like for families in an incident like this? Does it change if the weather's related? How do these types of things, sort themselves out?
Well, the key thing is this was an international flight. So that means compensation to the families, at least from the airlines, is governed by international treaty. And in this case, the treaty that applies is fairly antiquated. It's the Warsaw Convention. So when we're looking at what compensation the families will be able to get from the airlines, we have to look towards the Warsaw Convention. And unfortunately, that is limited to basically $23,000 per passenger, unless the families can show that the airline engaged in what's called willful misconduct. So normally that's, for example, a pilot did something which he knew was dangerous, or perhaps a mechanic didn't do a repair that he was supposed to do, some sort of willful misconduct. If you can show the willful misconduct, then you're no longer bound by those limits. Here, again, we don't know anything, although one thing that's kind of interesting is that the airline was not authorized to fly the route that it flew on the day that it did. Is that willful misconduct to be flying when you know that you don't have the authorization to do that? Maybe, maybe not, but that's one thing people will be looking at to see if we can use that to bust through the limits. That's for the airline. The question is the Warsaw Convention doesn't apply to any claims against any third parties who might be liable. So who might be liable? We take a look at it. One thing we're talking about now is that the weather conditions were such that icing may have damaged the engines. It's a relatively rare phenomenon. In fact, it's a very rare phenomenon. Little is known about it, but within the past few years, it's come to light that in this particular region of the world, icing can damage the engines. And the engines in this case were made by General Electric. If it turns out, for example, that General Electric knew of the problem, that the problem could be fixed relatively inexpensively, or a repair or a modification was feasible, and that was the cause of the accident, well, then General Electric may share some liability for the crash, and they're not bound by the Warsaw Convention. If the families can get the case in the United States, then and General Electric was responsible, or some other third party, then they would get full compensation for their loss.
I see. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch. Like I mentioned at the beginning, there are some answers starting to surface, but with the cause and then with the compensation that may come as a result, of course, there are many, many, many questions that are still out there to be answered around this tragedy. Once again, that was attorney Mike Danko. For more of his insight on this incident, be sure to visit the Aviation Law Monitor. Is at aviationlawmonitor.com. Thank you for joining me today, Mike.
Thanks, Colin.